Hi, I'm Jeff Lowe, Chief Executive Officer of Asian Sky Group and Asian Sky Media, here to give you a run through of our business jet fleet report for year-end 2020 for the Asia Pacific region. The report has a number of contributors, as it always does, and so I'd like to thank Aerion Supersonic, Dassault Aviation, Gulfstream, IATA, of which Asian Sky Group is a member, Metrojet, JSSI, and Sino Jet. Their contributions are always greatly appreciated. If you're tuning in to see one of our videos for the first time, just a little bit about Asian Sky Media. We are an award-winning media company based here in Asia. We've been recognized as the best media outlet in the Asia Pacific region for 4 years in a row now by the Asian Business Aviation Association. We are also media partners for a number of conferences and trade shows throughout the region as well. But first, let's get down into the report. This year's report was a little bit surprising, as you may have heard from my previous little video clip. Whereas we had expected the market to continue its trend down, actually the market surprised us all by turning up. In 2019, we had actually forecast that the market would probably be very close to zero growth or maybe even contract. But much to our surprise, having tallied the numbers for year-end 2020, the market grew actually 1.8%. And we haven't seen a number like that since 2017. So the fleet added a net 22 aircraft. If you look back over the last 5-6 years, that results in a compound growth of 2.5% for the region. Looking a little bit forward, we're not so sure we'll see the same numbers in 2021. And that's just because obviously COVID and the pandemic continues to linger and influence certainly international travel, of which is the majority of the type of travel we see out here in the Asia Pacific. Looking at specifically where that growth came from, and if you will, what regions and what countries specifically were responsible for that. The two big growth areas for the year, last year, 2020, were Greater China and Oceania. But really the story is Greater China. If you look at the 2019 number here, you'll see that that market contracted by 16 airplanes, but the pendulum has swung completely the other way. And now in 2020, you see that it's plus 14. So that's a swing of 30 aircraft, which we don't normally see when we compile our fleet reports. So a big change in fortunes when it comes to the Greater China area. And when you look at that specifically by country, you'll see that that is all due to the performance of mainland China. Mainland China, again, contracted in 2019, minus 4.1%. But swung completely the other way to a growth of 3.3% in 2020. And that was one of the big drivers for the numbers. If you look back at how some of the other regions performed and the whole market, you'll see again, it was led by mainland China, followed by the Australian markets. The largest market in Asia Pacific is mainland China. So really, as it goes, so does the rest of the Asia Pacific region. It's really the market that moves the needle, as they say. And so the fact that it grew, that certainly drove the whole region. Australia was a close second, registering growth of 6.6%. And that was where we saw the most additional aircraft being added this year. The worst market was Malaysia, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you can see the markets, mainland China being number 1, Australia number 2, and India number 3. Looking specifically at the top markets, Australia, mainland China, it's an interesting story in that there are markets that are probably in completely different spaces, if you will, at this point in time. Australia, a mature market, whereas mainland China is more a new growing market. And that you can see also in the type of aircraft that were added into those regions. If you look at Australia, added 13 airplanes, but 3/4 of those were pre-owned, and most of them were almost 20 years old. So you had some Citation 5s, some old Challenger 604s, even some Lear 35s and 36s. But then on the other side, if you look at mainland China, it added 11 airplanes, but the majority of those were new, 60% almost. And most of them were just 5-6 years old on average. So there you see 9 G650s, 3 G550s, a Gulfstream 600 as well. So the majority of those all being new aircraft. The bottom of the market, as we mentioned, is Malaysia, having lost 6 airplanes. Really no big story here. It's kind of spread across the fleet. Falcons, Legacies, Citations. And then in Korea, we saw a big drop as well, minus 4%. But that was as a result of a flight school that replaced its fleet. So we had 4 aircraft going out, but you had some coming back as well. Overall, if you look at the regions, Greater China represents 41% of the market out here, then followed by Southeast Asia at 22%. Again, as we mentioned, Greater China being the big driver, adding 14 airplanes and growth of 2.9%. Greater China being Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan combined. Big change, though, as we said, for Greater China. It actually contracted in 2018 and 2019. So much like we said for mainland China, Greater China swinging back into the black, if you will, growing almost 3%. And you can see that this really is quite a dramatic change, heightened here. If you look at the growth rates over the last 5 years, you can see back in 2016 and 17, certainly the Greater China market was clipping quite along at a nice pace, 5-7%. But it then swung dramatically back into negative growth and contracted both in 2018 and 2019, but has now swung back to 3% growth. And as I said, being 41% of the market out here, it really is the one that makes the difference and, as I said, moves the needle. Southeast Asia is another key market, and if anything, its fortunes haven't been as great. As you can see, the fleet growth rates have been declining over the last 3 years. Oceania has held its own and been a great contributor. Certainly 4, and 6% over the last 3 years. But the other 2 small markets, South Asia and East Asia, fluctuating back and forth and really being influenced by large, well, not even necessarily large, but given the size of those markets are quite small, when there is a move in the actual number of units, it tends to greatly affect the percentages. So not much happening in South Asia and East Asia. If we switch now to the OEMs and see how their fortunes are faring, Bombardier and Gulfstream continue to, if you will, battle for the domination of the Asia-Pacific market, sort of neck and neck. Bombardier at 28% and Gulfstream at 26%. Bombardier was the big gainer for the year, adding a net 11 aircraft, so 3.3% growth. It represents the biggest fleet in the Asia-Pacific region at 342 aircraft. Gulfstream is number 2, added a net 7 airplanes, 2.3% growth, size of its fleet being 315 airplanes, then followed by Textron, and then you really kind of drop down to, if you will, the next layer or the next tier being Dassault and Embraer and 97 and 73 airplanes, but both of them registering contractions for the year. So certainly the top 3 faring very well, but 4 and 5 not doing so well, seeing their market share contract. Kudos to Airbus, though. It had a good year, adding a plus 4 airplanes for a growth of 11.4%. Always interesting for me, once you get past, if you will, the regions and countries and the actual manufacturers, is to see what size category experienced the most growth. And again, probably not too surprising, as it is the most favored, if you will, category here in the Asia Pacific. You saw the long range category add 18 net airplanes, growth of almost 5%. The long range market represents a third of the fleet out here, and that market continues to deliver year after year after year. But again, as we mentioned at the beginning, really that being driven by long range aircraft going into the Greater China market. The light aircraft segment also fared very well, adding 10 airplanes, and that was really driven by the other key market that we mentioned at the beginning, by Australia. So long range, light, and then also the corporate airliners, which have managed to hold up even in the pandemic. All 3 size categories at measuring positive growth, whereas the other, the large, medium, and very light, all registering negative growth. Of particular interest is the large category, and you'll see it heightened here on this chart. Large has been continuing to lose market share over the last 5 years. Every year, the fleet gets smaller and smaller, and probably that's because those owners are, if you will, moving up into the long range, and so we certainly see that category continuing to grow and grow and grow every year, the long range category. So it has been a consistent contributor over the last 5 years, into the growth that we experience in the Asia-Pacific region. As I mentioned, the light category and also the corporate airliners performing very well, but the medium and very light not really making much of a contribution. So again, the long-range category is the one that really dominates the market out here. Let's not forget about the engines. Certainly the biggest supplier out here in the Asia-Pacific region is Rolls-Royce. And again, if you think of the aircraft types that had Rolls engines on them, again, it's not too surprising. Certainly in 2020, it had a good year, seeing growth of up over 1%. And again, that was being driven by the G650s that have been coming into the region. What's nice to see finally is some positive and big positive numbers for GE, plus 6% growth. And that's being driven by the global 7500s that we're now seeing coming into the region and the Passport engines. If we now switch to, if you will, go into a little bit more detail about where that net 22 aircraft came from, you'll see we had 38 new deliveries, 58 pre-owned additions, but then we also had 74 deductions through the year. So that came up to a net of plus 22. And just deductions isn't necessarily aircraft being sold out of the region. That could also be aircraft that were retired or aircraft that were relocated out of the region and are based in other regions of the world, or they're stored no longer airworthy. So deductions are a variety of possible sources for deductions. Historically, if you look back over the last 3 years, new deliveries have been declining every year. Pre-owned additions have been growing, but thankfully the deductions have been going down as well. So that's why we saw the positive growth for the year, plus 22. Delving down more into the new aircraft deliveries, and it's an interesting story here. Gulfstream was the leader as far as new aircraft coming into the region, and it experienced some growth versus 2019, 3 additional airplanes versus what they saw in 2019. And that also resulted in a big change, a net change in the dollar value of those additions to $270 million. And again, that's coming from G650s being delivered into the region. We had 10 new G650s delivered into the region during 2020. Bombardier, interesting story, they actually had less new deliveries, but their value went up by almost $60 million. And that is absolutely due to the global 7500s that are now being delivered. We had 7 aircraft come into the region during 2020, and that's why you're seeing a big net change in the dollar values. And there is the rest of the information for the other manufacturers going down the list. Pre-owned additions, again, Bombardier here at the top, big net change, had 9 additional deliveries, or additions I should say, versus 2019. But a lot of those were, as we saw from the Australian numbers, Learjets and old Challengers. So even though it had a big change in the net units, no real change in the dollar value. Where again, we saw the big change in the dollar values with Gulfstream, and that even though they had less aircraft being added, pre-owned aircraft being added to the region, the value of those airplanes, it being 6 G650s, 650ERs, that's why you saw the gain for them in the dollar value. Textron also saw a big gain in number of aircraft, 4 additional units versus 2019. But given the value of those airplanes, they're a small player when it comes to the total market in dollars. And when you look at deductions, it's pretty much everyone across the board had a different experience. Again, Bombardier saw on a unit basis 4 additional aircraft being removed from the region versus 2009. And that saw their dollar value go up. And that was a result of some Challenger 300s and 350s, some Global 6000s. Gulfstream, the bulk of the deductions they saw from the region were G550s. Again, probably not too surprising given the number of new G650s and pre-owned 650s we see coming into the region. Certainly you can see that 550s are getting replaced by 650s. Textron saw a lot of Citations and Hawkers leaving the region, Embraer, Legacy 600s, 650s, and some lineages, and Falcon 7Xs and Falcon 900s. So you can see the story here on the chart. If we look at the OEMs individually now, it's always an interesting story to see how each one fares and where their market presence really is. Again, Bombardier was number 1. It certainly had a good year in 2020, plus 11 airplanes, 3.3%. Its most popular aircraft in the region is the Global 6000. Most additions that it saw in 2020 were Global 7500s, and its largest market is the mainland in China. Gulfstream number 2 added seven airplanes, 2.3%. Most popular model is the G550, but most additions coming from the G650, and that being really direct replacements of 550s. Largest market, mainland China again. Textron, a little bit of a different story for them. Growth of 1.4%. Most popular model being the Citation XL, and where it saw most of its additions this year, Citation XLs as well. And not too surprisingly, the market where it is the dominant OEM is in Australia. Dassault didn't fare well through 2020, saw its fleet contract. Its most popular model in the region is the 2000, and the most additions it saw in 2020 were 2000s, and its largest market is mainland China as well. Embraer, number 5, again, didn't fare well either, along with Dassault, saw its market contract, minus 3.9%, 3 aircraft leaving the region net. Its most popular model is the Legacy 650, and it saw some Phenoms and some 145s come into the region. Its biggest market is India. Airbus did well through the year, ranked number 6, added 4 aircraft, plus 11.4%. So certainly on a percentage basis, it was the biggest grower of the year. And its most popular model is the ACJ 319, and that's what it added in 2020 as well. A couple of 319s. Its biggest market is mainland China. Boeing, last in the ranking, didn't have any additions or deductions, which maybe given all the challenges they've had over the last little bit, certainly with the MAX, maybe that's a good result for them. Its most popular model is the BBJ-1, and where it did see some additions, it was a BBJ MAX 8, the first one coming into the region. Largest fleet, again, mainland China. So when you kind of reflect back on those top 7, if you will, you can see how relevant the mainland China market is to it. The only ones that really step outside of mainland China is Australia and is India, where we see Textron and Embraer having the biggest market shares. We're now going to take a look at it, though, on a transactional basis. It's always very interesting. We looked at it on units, on a unit basis, but now when you look at it on a dollar basis, it's interesting to see the tail of the region as well. So we had new aircraft deliveries, which is pretty straightforward, 38. But that, as we said earlier, is a continuation of a contraction or reduction in new aircraft deliveries that we've seen over the last 3 years. So the market size of new aircraft deliveries in the Asia-Pacific region has been actually declining for 3 years in a row now. And so whereas in 2018 it represented a market of 2.6 billion, it's now down to a market of just 2.1 billion. So over those years, and certainly even just over the years of 2019 to 2020, we've seen that market contract almost 14%. On the pre-owned side, it's even more dramatic. Even though the numbers have held up, as in versus 2019, when you look at the dollar value, though, you can see it's continuing to contract. So again, when you look at, you go back as far as 2018 through 2020, you'll see the value of the pre-owned transactions in the region have declined almost $1 billion. It's lost 40% of its value over the last 2 years. So whereas before I used to be able to say the market was a $5 billion market out here, well, now all I can say is it's a $3 billion market. Still substantial, but again, it has shrunk considerably over the last couple of years. We're now going to take a look at the aircraft registry. Again, for me, always an interesting story. Where do people decide to base their aircraft? Yes, even though we are in the Asia-Pacific region, a lot of aircraft are registered outside of the region. And so it's always interesting to see where the trends are. Mainland China certainly saw some growth in 2020, and this is probably a function of the currency controls that are currently in place in the mainland. It's very hard to get US dollars out of China at the moment. So people are looking to make their purchases in RMB and finance in RMB, but this usually means that I have to register the aircraft in the mainland. So certainly we saw growth in the mainland China registry. We saw, interestingly, contraction as far as the US registered fleet, and that probably is a bit of a reaction to the ongoing, if you will, developments regarding offshore trusts and US trusts and the KYC requirements, maybe that making that registry a little less popular. The ones that are gaining then are those other offshore registries. You can see they added a plus 22 airplanes, seeing the biggest growth as well, 13.5%. The offshore registry has been growing over the last 2 years and grown almost 30% in total. So those offshore registries, if we look at that in a little bit more detail, where are they going? What jurisdiction is dominating that? You can see Cayman has 50% of the market, followed by San Marino, Isle of Man, Bermuda. But the big gainer being San Marino. It added 14 airplanes into their registry through 2020 for growth of 37%. And actually, if you look back over the last couple of years, that is phenomenal growth for San Marino, almost 300%. Half of their fleet, well, almost half the fleet, 42% is based in Greater China. And a lot of those aircraft are all under management with TAG Aviation, 30% of them. So San Marino has certainly done a great job over the last couple of years in establishing and growing their registry here. Again, Cayman being the lion's share to begin with at 50%. Isle of Man and Bermuda both losing aircraft, with Aruba picking up a couple. But again, Cayman being the dominant registry out here as far as the offshore registries. When we look at the top operators, always an interesting story here. Again, at the top of the list, we see Sino Jet with a fleet 47. It actually managed to add airplanes through the year. So hats off to Jenny and her team. They've managed to top the list again. They were number one last year and they're number one again this year, and they even added airplanes. The other big story for the year for me is BAA. So hats off to Libo Kai and his team. They added 10 airplanes through 2020. So when you think about it, under COVID, a pandemic, and everything else, they still managed to add 10 airplanes to their fleet. A phenomenal performance for BAA. And also, if you will, honorable mentions for Jet Aviation as well. So hats off to, if you will, my old friend Carlos Gomez, who's just arrived back. They added 4 airplanes through the year and came in at number 5. So really Sino, BAA, and Jet Aviation both having great performance through the year. It's always interesting to see look at the fortunes of the rest, if you will. The top 20 operators represent 34% of the fleet. Yes, fortunes go up and down. Of note, though, it's certainly is Amber Aviation. Since they've been formed, they have managed every year to grow their fleet. So consistency is a big thing, and certainly they have managed to have it year after year after year. So every year since their launch in 2016, they've managed to grow their fleet. So hats off to Mr. Chong and his team on continuing to grow their fleet despite all the adverse conditions we have at the moment. So there you have it, the top 5, the top 20. And again, hats off to Sino Jet for their performance through the year. For the Business Jet Fleet Report, there's a whole bunch of other, if you will, features included, commentaries and interviews. We've got content in the magazine or content in the report from Sino Jet, Metrojet on their new facility in Clark, Aerion on their supersonic business jet, the AS2, JSSI and IATA as well. We've got a special section that touches on COVID-19 and the impact on business aviation, and also on the future of connectivity, which is very interesting. A special feature. Probably the biggest change or biggest addition or the highest point for the report this year is it does feature the new Dassault Falcon 10X on the cover. And as we had mentioned earlier, that was part of the reason for our delay in releasing the report. We were able to put that aircraft on the cover, and she's a beauty, and we're glad to have her on the cover. There's also a spotlight in the magazine, in the report on the G650ER as well. Now, normally here, I would probably delve more into COVID-19 as it is in the Business Jet Fleet Report, but actually our sort of sister publication that comes out at this time, Asian Sky Quarterly, has a lot more details. So I felt it was probably valuable to all the listeners at the moment to use our Asian Sky Quarterly to 2020, but what happened as a result of COVID and what effects it had on market sentiment, people's intentions, and so on, which I think all of you will find interesting. Here's the results of a market survey that we do every quarter. And this starts from back in 2018 and goes through first quarter 2021. But if you look at the optimism, if you will, that people have at the current time, you can see the dramatic effect that certainly COVID had on the region, with all of those major dips occurring in the first quarter of 2020, second quarter of 2020. As we all know, Greater China, if you reel the dark red line, it got hit by COVID first. And so you can certainly see that it dips down the lowest first. And then sort of in the second quarter of last year is when the other regions really started to feel the impact. But through the year, things improved. And now here we are, first quarter 2021. And most confidence or optimism in the region is back up to over 80, between 80 to 90%. It's interesting to look at the optimism levels between mainland China and Hong Kong. Although we presented as a combined number in the previous chart, there actually are quite a lot of differences quarter by quarter that are experienced between mainland China and Hong Kong. And as we can all probably appreciate, this is all due to a number of probably global economic factors or more local factors. And certainly here you can see the US trade dispute, for instance, the continued unrest in Hong Kong through 2019, the onset of COVID, the establishment of the new security law in Hong Kong, and then continuing effects and, if you will, lingering effects due to COVID. So there is a difference between the mainland and Hong Kong, and you see that optimism, if you will, the outlook of the regions being quite different at times, depending on the quarter. To 270 million. And again, where they feel they are economically, are we at the low point? Are we past that low point? Or are we still not even reached that low point? And so again, we're looking back to the first quarter of 2020. You can see that not reach the low point being at 50%. But through the year, and as we've now gotten into the first quarter of 2020, you can see people who feel we're at the low point or we're past that low point are now almost 85%. And so big change in the view of everyone in the region as far as where we are economically. So again, you can see how this directly relates back to the optimism people have. If you're feeling optimistic, you're probably feeling optimistic because your business is performing better. And so it all goes kind of hand in hand. Not too surprisingly then, this is how it looks for purchase intention. Generally, if you're not feeling good about your business and you're pessimistic about the future, you're not going to go out and buy an airplane. So again, when you look back, you can see the no, I'm not sure number hitting a peak back in the second quarter of 2020. Almost 60% of the respondents said, no, I'm not buying an airplane. But over time, as things have improved, we're seeing that number slowly trend down. And so, yes, now we're into that market where we're seeing 45% of the market interested in buying an aircraft now, and it being equally split between whether it's a new aircraft or a pre-owned aircraft. Looking back at flights over the 2020 period, again, this chart goes all the way back to 2020 and then up to March 2021. But again, you can see the impact that COVID had on the region, with certainly the biggest dip coming in April of last year, where departures were down almost 70% versus the previous year. A lot of people have talked about where that recovery is and where we're seeing it now that we're into 2021. But again, you can see here that for the region, most of the flying is happening certainly from 1 to 2 hours in duration or 2 to 3 hours. We're still not seeing a lot of long-range international flights taking place. Where we're seeing the market develop, and you can see it highlighted very clearly in this chart, is in large domestic markets, mainland China, India. That's where the flight activity is taking place at the moment. Markets like Singapore and Hong Kong that have no domestic market and rely purely on international still are waiting for that recovery to come. But certainly mainland China and India at the moment being where all the flight activity is coming. If you look specifically at Greater China, and again, you can see that it's domestic flying, 1 to 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours. Nothing happened longer than really 4 hours at most. And so that's where we're seeing the flights bounce back. Again, with the Business Jet Fleet Report, Asian Sky Quarterly has a number of additional features in there. We've got Clyde & Co. talking about defaults, recoveries, and opportunities. Amstat providing their global overview. Global Jet Capital providing their global overview. And we appreciate those contributions immensely. We've got Sino Jet and also Comlux with some interviews. As far as an aircraft spotlight, we took the advantage of being exposed to the Falcon 10X to provide if you will, a first look at the ultra long range jets. So the Gulfstream G700, the Global 7500, and the Falcon 10X. So here you have a first look comparison at those 3 new ultra long range airplanes. We've got a pre-owned analysis of the XRS and the Global 6000. And then finally, we've also got an update on the Falcon 6X first flight. As always, we appreciate you taking the time to listen in. If you want to download the reports, please go to www.asianskymedia.com. You can get the reports down there. And I thank you again for tuning in and watching.